Hey, this is Navya. Last week I posted my vlog from Purgatory 10 and I intentionally avoided talking about one now controversial moment from the convention. This was the Jensen and Misha panel. Before you get your hopes up, this is not a hot take video. I am not going to pick sides. I'm not going to denigrate either Jensen or Misha or any of their fans. What I hope to do with this video is explain to you as a fandom psychologist what happened, why it happened, and hopefully leave you with a better understanding of the people that you've been arguing with online. A bit of a disclaimer before I deep dive. I am not going to express my personal opinion on this matter or on Destiel in this video. I'm not trying to keep this a secret. If you look through my channel or you look through my Instagram, I'm sure that you will find rather easily where I stand on these things. The only reason that I'm choosing not to mention it here is because I don't want that taking away from the message that I'm trying to communicate. I will express one personal opinion on this matter, which is that experiencing this panel firsthand and seeing everyone's responses to it online has felt like living through ground zero of fandom history. And I'm finding that many people are using this and using this incident as a means to discredit discourse in the fandom. And as an academic, this is gravely concerning to me for two key reasons. First, parasocial relationships are absolutely real. I will die on this hill. We form relationships with fictional characters and celebrities, and experiencing the wash of emotions that comes with that is perfectly normal, and it does not need to be suppressed unless it's like actively harming others. And second, in this age of AI slop and misinformation, being able to critically think, evaluate, and engage with media is a skill that none of us should be taking for granted, and all of us should be trying to actively develop. So, healthy and respectful discourse to me is the best and honestly the most fun parts of any fandom because it's so intellectually stimulating. So please give me your wildest opinions and I will give you mine as long as we can mutually respect each other's boundaries. Okay, so let's start by talking about the Destiel side of the fandom. So there are many people in the fandom, not a majority, but there are many people in the fandom who believe that Dean and Castiel being romantically linked is canon, as they say. This is not everybody. Some people are more vocal about it than others, but it's kind of a spectrum. Some people believe that there were romantic tones in the writing. Some people believe that it's actively canon. And some people go so far as to being very, very vocal about this in public spaces. So, spectrum, right? Now, what actually happened at the panel? So, at the panel, there was a question by an audience member which related to Destiel. The audience member asked Jensen this question, and they prefaced it by saying that this question was asked to Misha at a different panel, and Misha gave an answer that they would now tell the entire room after Jensen answered. That was the preamble to this particular conversation. The question specifically was, how would Supernatural be different? How would the show be different if Castiel, Misha's character, was introduced in season 1 instead of season 4 as it ended up happening? So Jensen's response to that was very simple and short, which is, we would have been cancelled. That was brilliant. That was a great response. They then go on to, the audience member then goes on to talk about what Misha responded to this, which I'm not going to repeat the answer, but I'm sure many of you have seen the clip by now, many of you have seen the video by now. So the answer basically leaned very heavily into some of the themes of Destiel. So let's break this down. I wanted to understand where all of this is coming from. So I did speak to a bunch of people at the convention and a bunch of people after the convention to try to understand what really was happening around Destiel way before I joined the fandom. So like when the show was still on, when things were going, like how was Destiel perceived, how are things going. There are some things that I do know about Supernatural writing and about the relationship between the writers and the producers in the fandom, and of course the cast as well, which is a physical embodiment of all of this other stuff. But what I understood was, for a very long time, there was a tabooification of Destiel, as opposed to some of the other themes in supernatural fan fiction, like Wincest, to mention just one, um, and to mention one of the more popular ones. So Destiel was something that came out of community fandom fan fiction, um, as were some other things. But there was a big sort of lid kept down on Destiel, which is like you were not allowed to talk about it. You were not allowed to mention it at panels. There was a lot of like suppression around this topic. And when you have a concept, any kind of concept, or when you have something that so many people regularly engage with being basically banned from certain spaces, basically being like, you can't talk about this in this space, but in other spaces people are already talking about it and it's already happening, and there are thoughts about it and opinions about it and ideas about it, and all of this stuff is happening. It feels like this stuff needs to be kept underground. And what happens is, when you lift the lid on this and when you let all of this stuff come out into the open, um, the pendulum kind of swings in the opposite direction. Let me try to illustrate this with an example. This is not an example that I'm choosing for any particular reason other than the fact that it really, really helps in understanding what's happening here. So, back in the 50s, specifically in the US, because I know a lot of you have consumed American media and would understand this reference, there was this era of McCarthyism and lavender marriages. I'm sure many of you have heard the term lavender marriages floating around the internet now, even if you did not know what it was originally and how it came about. So there was a lot of McCarthyism, obviously, and there were a lot of lavender marriages. Basically, what that meant was, if you were a homosexual in that time, in the period of the 40s and the 50s, you were considered to be a communist. That's just how it was. To put it like, to boil it down into like very simple terms. And following that, you had this like the hippie era of the 60s and the 70s, right? Where all of a sudden, queer culture was out in the open, like completely out in the open. And people were, for the first time in a very long time, could be themselves. And that was great. But what happens with that is the pendulum starts swinging a little bit in the other direction. And what I mean by that is, in the late 70s and the early 80s, when we started having the AIDS pandemic, and men, specifically homosexual men, were started being told that, hey, there's a disease spreading through this particular population, and you might want to keep a lid a bit on your sexual activities and your sexual partners. What that ended up doing is it created this kind of push within the community that's like, no, because for a very long time they had to keep, like, be a secret essentially, and now they had this opportunity to be open, so they didn't want to like go back to living in that like fear and living underground, you know. And that's kind of the same thing, which I fully recognize the irony of presenting this particular metaphor in order to explain what's happening with Destiel, but that's the best I could come up with. I'm sorry. So that's kind of what happened with the with Destiel as well. For a really long time, it couldn't be talked about, it couldn't be brought up in panels, it couldn't be brought up in public spaces. And then all of a sudden, Misha comes out at a panel and says that he played his character with certain romantic undertones, and there were certain romantic elements to his final scene with Dean, and all of a sudden everything is fair game, everything is out in the open. And so the pendulum kind of swings the other way a little bit, where people go to the extremes in terms of asking questions, in terms of bringing out topics that were for such a long time discussed in closed private spaces. And that's what we saw play out on the big stage at Purgatory. Second part of this is that for a very long time, and still today, but less so now we see a lot more of sort of stuff coming out of like Wattpad and making it into like shows and like making it into legitimate like books and things like that. But for a very long time, fan art and fan fiction was seen as less than, it was seen as illegitimate, compared to like more conventional publishing media or like more conventional television. But now you see like a lot of stuff, like a lot of stories get taken off of Wattpad and made into shows and movies and things like that. So fan art and fan fiction is becoming like more and more normalized. And if you take a look back a little bit at the history of Supernatural, you will see that the show itself has a very sort of rich and strong and solid history of the writers and the audience co-creating things. So the writers have almost always responded to things that have been going on in the fandom and to thoughts and opinions and ideas of the fandom. And it's almost as though the audience is a collaborator in producing the show. So it's never really been this one-way street where the writers are like, we have a story that we're giving to you. It's more like, we have a story, but what are your thoughts on it? And then they kind of take that and they run with it a little bit. And that's the brilliance of like Supernatural writers and producers and directors. That's one of the best things. That's one of the reasons we feel so personally connected to it. But when something like that happens, we also start taking a little bit of the ownership of these characters. We feel more personally invested than we would have if it was just something that someone wrote and gave it to us. So that's one of the other things that we see happening in this particular space, which is with characters like Cass and Dean. The audience, especially the Destiel audience, feels a little bit like they carry a bit of the ownership of these characters. And as a result of that, we don't see the actors who portray these characters as the characters are not simply theirs, they're theirs and ours. So they may be the embodiment of those characters on screen and in the show, but the characters are also a little bit ours. So we feel protective of that. So we end up feeling a little bit protective of the actors who play them as well, which can inevitably lead to a little bit of like coddling these actors, right? So one of the things that I noticed in the last few weeks was a lot of people were trying to be very protective of Jensen after the panel. A lot of people were trying to be very protective of Misha after the panel, because depending on like which side you ended up on and who you agreed with. So that is a very direct result of feeling a sense of ownership over these characters. So where does that leave us? Well, art is inherently subjective, and having interpretations of these characters, feeling ownership over these characters, having opinions that differ from the artists who play them or the writers who have written them or the producers who made the show happen, having interpretations that are different from all of these people, that is our prerogative as the audience. The complexity of being able to hold multiple contradictory truths at once is what makes us an intellectual species. It's what makes us human. So let's take all of this information and let's extend a hermeneutic of goodness to our fellow fandom friends. Because regardless of where we stand on this topic, regardless of what our personal opinions are, each and every one of us deserves to be treated with kindness and empathy. That's all. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. And I will see you next time.